that we are talking about what WTO can do, and I agree with Ambassador Bhatia that as long as the WTO is a rule, is an institution which only enforces legally binding rules under a dispute settlement mechanism like the appellate body, people are now scared even to come to WTO to negotiate and agree to something. But the other important point that I want to make is that in none of the discussions we are giving any thought to how technology is driving the trading system now. Does institutions have any role to play? Does even national governments, have they got any role to play? Or is it the technologies that are newly coming into fore which automatically makes globalization inevitable? Take India, the case itself. Now we are all sitting here, we take our mobile phone, we order anything from anywhere and it is delivered. In a system like this, is globalization not automatically taking place? And if technology is the factor, the countries which develop those technologies will automatically drive the world towards multilateralism. Where does WTO stand? Where does UNCTAD stand? We have been in UNCTAD, we have been in WTO, and our days, fortunately they were all numbered because now the kind of technologies that we are seeing now, it makes me wonder whether institutions have any role to play at all. And that brings me to the point which Fred was making, that companies will now companies which own these technologies, as a result of which they will be able to sell all over the world, because what is developed in one part of the world is instantaneously known to the rest of the world. Poor or rich does not matter. And the governments are in no position to control these things. So, if I may conclude by say that Arvind's presentation was wonderful, but there is no factoring in of what technology is doing to all these things. 1930s, it is, to my mind, it is irrelevant. Between two world wars, what happened, to my mind, it is irrelevant. What happened in 1990s, to my mind, it is irrelevant. What happens in 2020 is relevant to me. And I am seeing it, witnessing it every day. So would some panelists, or Arvind, at least in his next research, factor in the technological factor into all these graphs? Thank you.
Excellent question. What role does technological disruption play in towards our objective of regulatory convergence? But perhaps now the panelists would like to respond to some of the issues which have been raised from the floor. Who would like to go first?
Well, I'd like to come back on the issue of regulatory convergence, and I really would like to put this as a question, not as a given, but as a question: how far do we need to go? And partly, I think this is driven by the factual integration of industries. If you have a highly integrated global economy, you need to have a certain level of convergence. Otherwise, you have to renationalize, and then people will pay as consumers. Things will get more expensive. The cars will, maybe that's a good thing, but cars will be more expensive and other things. And that also gets me to the question of Fred. How much can we privatize this? We do that in ISO, pharma does it, but when it comes to public policy issues, governments want to be involved. Food security, for example. We have this approach with the with food safety, with the Codex Alimentarius and the SPS agreement here, and this is a kind of a mixture here where we address regulatory standards in a sort of a lot of private influence in government lawmaking, but it is about food safety, and that's a safety issue which cannot be completely left to the private sector. So I think probably you need both. We also need to explore the cooperation of WTO with other specialized international organizations. It's not a matter of doing these norms within the WTO, but actually to facilitate how the linkages can be made. I'd like to just make one more point on why multilateralism for regulatory convergence is more suitable. I don't think you can do this on a bilateral level because of the free riding problem. You may agree among two, but you can only apply one regime to everybody. So you will have a lot of people who will not be obliged to comply with these rules while you are de facto. And so I think the approach we now see on bilateralism is not going to lead anywhere. My last point as a European, I was very impressed about your chart of divergence, but I think you have to take into account that European integration is a political project and it's about creating peace. And it was about integrating countries like Bulgaria and Romania, who were developing countries essentially. So it's quite natural, I think, that there is a huge divergence. And I think in this political project, it's just a matter of bringing about cohesion and in the very long run here. But I don't think that this evolution does denigrate the European commitment to a rule-based open trading system. And I think if it's about building a coalition, you can be sure that countries like Switzerland, who are extremely dependent on open markets, but countries like Germany, who created 900,000 jobs and lost about 400,000 through to globalization, will be very, very strongly supporting this. And we should not be impressed just by the current American attitudes. They may go over in 4 years, and we just have to bridge this gap.
Thank you. Greg?
So I'll make 3 quick points. The first on technology, of course, everyone, economists always tell us that technology makes people much more vulnerable in terms of their jobs and trade. But the politicians, it's much easier to blame foreigners than it is to blame technology. And so they do that. And that's the reason why we see challenges about migration and about trade. But I think what we really need to address, which I don't think we've really raised, is how do we try to alleviate the sense of vulnerabilities of people who have less skills and less education than us on the panel. And I don't think anyone's figured that out. There's been lots of proposals, lots of experimentation in Europe and the United States. But until in Europe and the United States we figure out how to reduce this sense of vulnerabilities, we're going to have the politics that we see now. So I think this is something really real. And I think that anybody who is a multilateralist, who believes in trade, who believes in integration, really has to address this. And it's actually, I think, the central challenge of our time. Second is, Arvind said, we had a very globalized world before. It can collapse. It's not a one-way street. It's not guaranteed. What we do have, which is different here, is that we have a much more functioning multilateral institutional setup than we did before. And that's an institutional check. Institutions have a certain stickiness. We're seeing this within certain countries right now in terms of domestic institutions. And so there's hope for that, and there's a major role for the WTO in that respect as well. Third, in terms of the WTO's rulemaking, Fred talked about private standard setting. Standards, regulatory convergence and cooperation is really difficult. I don't see, just to be realistic, it's going to be very difficult to happen at the WTO. It's very difficult to happen between the United States and Europe. The 1997 mutual recognition agreement they signed simply could not be put into effect. It was a failure. The idea that this is going to become a model globally, I think, is unrealistic. The regulatory cooperation chapters you see in TPP is really nothing is really there. And if you look at TTIP, it's basically the US trying to export its regulatory framework to Europe and Europe trying to do the same to the United States. Very difficult for them to agree. So to think about this, I think it's going to be, in the WTO, is going to be a challenge, which is the reason why I think it's best to think about the WTO as part of an overall ecology of rulemaking, which involves bilaterals, involves multilateral, but it's the most important. It's the peak organization. It's the pinnacle. And this is true with both the rulemaking. How can we think about private standard setting, to go to Fred's question, in terms of labeling and so forth, in light of WTO rules? How do we think of bilaterals, and what's the role of the dispute settlement bodies in terms of interpreting WTO rules in light of this larger ecology?
Thank you.
I'll just make a couple of quick comments. I thought the observation that now much of what we'll do is really around the issue of behind the borders and at the borders, the challenges that we face in trade. I think that that's really bang on, and in that sense, the trade facilitation agreement was a great step forward. And as we move towards implementation of that, I think there will be much to be gained for all members. And in that context and in the services context, I think I'd like to actually talk about an idea that we have been putting out for discussion, and that is for a trade facilitation in services. Because if there are issues in export of goods, there are sometimes even more stringent areas in the export of services, and this is increasingly happening as we have become, as countries are becoming more and more protectionist. We are going to see much more of this. So I think the time for a trade facilitation in services is something that's absolutely relevant at the WTO now, and this is something that we should be talking about as a way of really sharing the fruits of globalization amongst each other. The second observation that I would like to make is regarding the comment on multinational-led liberalization, or I think this is an idea we've already tried. In fact, it is exactly this idea which has led to the current pushback, because when a multinational begins to work, his objective can only be profit maximization. And a multinational, therefore, as it moves across boundaries, will take the jobs, will take the benefits where it works best for that particular multinational. So if the rule making is to be done this way, then perhaps the difficulties and the challenges for national governments is the issue of accountability to their people. So I don't think that this is going to work. We've tried it. This is exactly the kind of difficulty against which the recent US election appears to be a pushback. So I think that this is a path to be advocated with tremendous caution, because it hasn't worked so far. It may not work in future.
Thank you. I have a number of thoughts. I'll start with Ujjal's point, and I'll want to combine two parts of your statement. One was that WTO needs to revisit its guiding ethos. And the second was, you pointed out there is a difference between legally binding agreements and aspirational ones. That's true. The point I was making is that the WTO has to revisit its guiding ethos. So, we actually in WTO also have aspirational agreements. And we have combinations of them, and we have methods which we use to actually allow an aspirational to become a legally binding one. One example is the telecom reference paper, where there are certain agreements on what is desired. Some countries say, yes, we agree to do this, legally binding. Others move towards it. Flexibilities, transition periods are there. But if you can't get consensus, one reason, and you can't actually pass it through your legislature, one reason why I feel Mr. Obama agreed to an aspirational one, and he really wanted the Paris Agreement to go through, was because he knew he will not have to go to Congress for that. 23 states in the US challenged him that he had exceeded his authority. It's a different thing. Let's see what President Trump does. But these are mechanisms to put in place agreements which are reached and enable them to pave the way for further kind of legally more binding agreements. So that's something we must keep in mind. My second thought relates to Hamid's point that most regulatory issues will be applied MFN anyway. Actually, whenever we make this statement, we should distinguish between regulation and rules about implementation of regulation. The whole TTIP was an effort about the rules and coherence. Otherwise, coherence doesn't have any meaning. All these efforts at regulatory convergence, coherence, and it's a whole spectrum, have no meaning. Your MRAs in your GATS itself have no meaning. So MRAs actually are bilateral. So I don't think the application is multilateral. So, and this is true for many regulations. So it's not a given. Therefore, we need to make an effort to make it or move towards multilateral. And I agree that there will be, there is a possibility of moving towards that in WTO far more in an incremental way, the way the RCEP is moving forward. So we must keep that in mind that, you know, I've heard this thought very often that regulations are applied multilaterally in any way. They are not. So, and it's very important. Then the whole issue of technology, do institutions and governments have to play a role? This was a very important question you raised. I mentioned technology in my points, but you have raised a very important separate issue. When technology is moving the way it is moving, is there a role for governments and institutions?
I have always felt globalization is the effect, technology is the cause. We make our discussions here as if globalization came first. No. The globalization, even today, I would say that globalization, willy-nilly you desire it or you don't desire it, it is the effect. And we are mistaking the cause for the effect. The cause is technology. And any nation, rich or poor, those who are able to develop technologies which will be universally found valuable, because the internet is there, people find everything. From in India, for example, HIV kit, it was developed in Hyderabad, where HIV kit, you can detect it within 10 minutes. The moment it was revealed, there was a furore in the rest of the world as to how it can be made universal. My point is that even in very, very small things, when technology does something, it becomes globalized. It doesn't matter whether some country likes it or not. So I feel that whatever institutions do or whatever nations do, they have to take into account the fact that, look here, the way we want to export or we want to deal with the rest of the world, unless we develop technologies which are universally found valuable, they will automatically take place regardless of whether one likes it or not. Now WTO today is in no position, it's not even thinking about this kind of a thing, and it is still the ethos, as Ambassador Bhatia pointed out. WTO is still living in the world of manufactured goods alone entering the world trade. It is still thinking in terms of controlling at the border, non-tariff barriers, tariff barriers, sophisticated barriers, things of that sort. But our thinking for the future should take into account the fact that willy-nilly the world will trade, each nation will trade with another nation based on technological factors from small to very big. In India itself, you see what is happening with the software of Microsoft. Any small improvement made, it is captured within India the next day and it is purchased. So that's the point I'm making.
No,
I'm not in disagreement with any of the other
No, no,
points which are made.
no, but-
we are still going in that direction. Thank you.
Sir, three thoughts come to my mind. I completely agree with you. That's my first thought. Second is actually, if you remember, Arvind said 80% of globalization is due to technology. So it's recognized. And the point I made is technology will not only globalize, because there is a difference between globalization and multilateralization. Will not only globalize, it will completely make you change the way you actually see globalization. The rules of the game which exist in FTAs, rules of origin, etc., will completely become useless. So new ways of thinking need to be done. So I completely agree with you, sir. That's
I think in India, complete agreement is usually the basis for the start of a long discussion.
So can I move to another thought? Would you allow me to do that? Okay. So the thing is that a very good point which was made by Professor Cotier, which is that trade, the scope of trade has today expanded to such an extent that WTO is no longer the only main forum looking at trade regulation. You have ILO, you have other forum, you have groups like G20 which give rise to other kinds of thought. So it's very important that a coordinated kind of look be taken. What is the coverage of trade? And in that context, I completely agree with the kind of implications of industry to industry making of regulation, but in some areas it's happening, like internet. You know, so the kind of and there is a tension there. You have one body which is an industry body, and then you have an international forum like the ITU. And there was a reason why the ITU meeting in Russia could not reach a conclusion, because of the major difference of opinion in certain aspects of the implications. So these are very important things, but we cannot today do things without interacting with the company, especially in high technology areas, because they know more, especially in regulation. So you need to interact, but you need to also regulate, because data, privacy, I mean, I'm just giving you one example. There is a role for government, there is a role for institutions. So the role is there, the nature of the role changes. That's the point I'm making. Then in the other part is that implications of services liberalization, very important question which you've asked, but where I see the process going in WTO is the 4 modes of services are as relevant for goods. You have FDI in goods. It's mode 3. Should we look at trade in a larger way and have rules also in a larger way? So these are some of the thoughts we need to work on.
Thank you. We have now 5 minutes left.
You didn't give me a chance.
No, I will.
I'm happy to forgo it in the interest of getting to wine quicker.
No, what I suggest is that can we have one last intervention from the floor, after which each of the panelists will make their concluding comments. Anybody? Yes, please. David.
If it is the case that the President of the United States sees trade relations as essentially transactional, and that the analogy is really that of private contractual negotiations, what stake do you think the United States would have in the future in the WTO?
Excellent question. I would now invite my panelists to come in with their last comment, starting with Arvind this time.
No, I wanted to. I'm happy not to respond to the questions, but I'll just respond to this last question. We always, I think, a cardinal error of anything is to extrapolate the recent past, and I think there will be life, after, as Thomas rightly said, there will be life after Trump. I mean, so I think we should keep that perspective in mind. But the question still is, what if it's, what do we do in the interim, right? I think that this whole notion that it links to the other question about, leave it all to the private sector to navigate the rules, and, I think there are two great examples in history where, it could really come back and haunt you very badly. After all, remember the original anti-populist movement in the late 1900s, late 1800s in the US was against monopolies and Standard Oil and the financial sector and so on. So even in the global financial crisis, we thought that all these were all private sector banks, but ultimately, to paraphrase Mervyn King, in debt everything becomes public, really. So this private-public distinction really doesn't hold, at least in extreme situations. But I think there is a way to, so when I said, the middle-income countries should get together and be willing to play ball on the reciprocity game, that meets the transactional imperative that President Trump might have. So I think, we have to, you as someone said, you go to play with the leaders you have, not with the leaders you wish you had. So in that sense, there is a way of, making it transactional. Mercantilism, we don't like it, but that's the way the world seems to function. So I think it is possible to do that. But I think that's where I think the leadership being to be exhibited by the middle-income countries will have to include being willing to play the transactional game in the interim. So I think that, so that would be my response. And I'll stop. The only question, I think Hamid asked a very nice question about, the political economy of services to some extent. And I thought a little bit, not very much about this. But it seems to me that, supposing you think that services are basically kind of more skill intensive than manufacturing was, then on the one hand, I think that the whole displacement issue becomes less kind of intense and salient with services, semi-skilled and skilled workers. But on the other hand, I get the sense that maybe they mobilize much better. So they're going to be, reacting much stronger to any, competitive pressure that's put in them because Indians are exporting services. So I don't know how it will come out overall. But it's something that we haven't thought about enough. If the accusation is that, the WTO hasn't moved beyond the manufacturing, behind the thing, even in terms of conceptually thinking about political economy of these things, I still think we think in terms of manufacturing and not in terms of services.
Yeah. Thank you. Peter, would you like to come in?
Very quickly, I think what I heard from everybody really is that despite all the difficulties, there is certainly a need for multilateralism, and that the reason is because we are also economically integrated, that there is no other way to go except to find a platform where we can all talk to each other. And I think the way forward in that has got to be that what we have learned in the past has been some of the distortions that have crept into our system. And as we come together to go ahead, addressing those distortions and the lack of transparency and process in what has been, we have witnessed at the WTO is something that we will need to redress if we are really to face the issues squarely and to be able to tackle them. On the issue of services, I think that the point being made often about India, and when I looked at Arvind's chart, I really wished it was true that we could, as a country, play such a significant role. Today, the fact is that India accounts for 3% of the global services trade. That's a very, very small percentage. And in order to be able to become a larger exporter of services, there's a lot of work to be done within our own boundaries and our own borders, with our own regulations and systems, before we can really be an exporter of services. So what we do is largely piggybacking on IT services, but there's a whole world out there that we still have to reach. So I think there's a lot of work, and it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. One, we are now in a revision of the era of industrial policy, but it's new industrial policy because of technology, etc. So whatever we feel we need to do about multilateralism, people will have to take account of this emphasis on industrial policy and investment in technology. And secondly, if we have to make things acceptable multilaterally, not only in the Trump's era of transactional interaction, we have to think of what to transact in order to make progress, but the rules of the game of the multilateral system also needs to change. And I pointed out only MFN, and there are examples in WTO on conditional MFN, where you actually do not apply the same rule across the board. For example, we can have a discussion later in details, but Article 27 of subsidies agreement is a place to start on that.
Thank you. Thomas?
Just to conclude, I'd like to reiterate a point Rita made about WTO and inequality. I think this has always been with us, and the legitimacy of the WTO in the long run depends whether equal opportunities can be realized or not. Now, the challenge is no longer so much still there, but it is newly also within industrialized countries. And we have to think very hard how equality of opportunities can be re-established. And my answer to David's question about the transactional nature would be that the transactional attitude to trade will not be able to bring the jobs back. And so it's just a matter of time until people ask for other questions. And we're here to prepare the answer to these other questions and to anticipate what needs to be done. And that gets us very far also into domestic policy, the relation between welfare policy, and which is not an antinomy to trade, an open trade. Countries like Switzerland and Sweden don't have these debates because we are very inclusive societies. So all these questions need to be debated, even within the WTO. I agree. But I was a negotiator for the TRIPS agreement, and we started from scratch. And Joshua Wattel is also in the room, and we really started like students. You know, what is the problem here? What should be done? And I think we're there where we have to go back with a view to find a negotiated settlement in the long run. But the intellectual process has to go through. We don't have just the recipes to take from.
I agree. Great.
I just want to maybe conclude pointing with Harsha that it's time to think also about the role of developing norms, which in a soft law type way, because they also can have a stickiness to them, and eventually they can ripen into something harder. As others become more comfortable with them, they start to become institutionalized in habits and practices. And so we probably want to think in that way. And that links to this, I think we're at a time of modesty as opposed, until we solve the basic issue, which to me is a fundamental issue of the sense of vulnerability of citizens from technology and from trade in the United States and Europe. Until we address that and figure it out, we better be modest. We can still continue all these discussions. It's important on regulation, rulemaking, sort of building for the future, building norms. But in terms of like hard binding rules and dispute settlement, I think that was another time, and it may come back again, but we're not there now.
Thank you. I believe we have come to the end of a very thought-provoking and a very rich discussion on the various strands of the issue and the question that we have been discussing. I will not even try to summarize these ideas that have been floated by our very distinguished panelists. I would only like to thank them for their contributions and just on the behalf of the organizers to thank all of you for being such a good audience. The dinner will be served within 5 minutes. I think that's all the time the hotel staff need to reorganize these chairs into tables and so on. And unless the organizers would like to make any announcement for tomorrow.
Never going to miss that opportunity. Sorry, I'm going to play spoilsport here and step between you and dinner. I'd request everybody to please come on stage for a quick group photograph before we proceed for dinner. Thank you.
Excuse me.